Kings and Generals is proud to announce that this is one of the many incredible channels that we've partnered up with for Project Ukraine. Project Ukraine is a playlist dedicated to telling the past of the Ukrainian people to aid them in the present. Your likes, shares and donations to the charity we're collaborating with will have a direct impact in aiding the most vulnerable citizens of Ukraine. We have partnered up with the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, which was bombed by the Russian troops at the start of the invasion. Today, the foundation has transformed its projects, refocusing its resources and efforts on purchasing and delivering humanitarian aid to civilians and evacuating people from combat zones. In the first week of April, the center provided over 7,000 food baskets to patients and doctors at Kyiv hospitals, to bomb shelters in the Kyiv underground, as well as to people with disabilities and elderly people who cannot leave their homes. They also provided targeted assistance to 3,354 people, delivering specific medications, food and hygiene products on individual requests. We hope that viewers would consider donating to this noble cause and help with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
The lone soldier lights a cigarette. His country, Russia, has been torn apart before his very eyes. Numerous factions claim territory from Siberia to Petrograd, but his concerns only lie with two of them. He can support the independence movement in his homeland, Ukraine, a promising future if they can win it. Or he can stay in the Red Army and help forge a new Bolshevik Union to become a power on the world stage. Either way, he decides, one thing is for certain: the war would cost thousands of lives and devastate his homeland. The bloody struggle known today as the Ukrainian War of Independence is about to begin. In February of 1917, Russia was rocked with revolution. The Tsar was ousted, and a new government took power, which in turn left the Russian military in chaos. Among the first acts of the new provisional government in Petrograd was its move to encourage greater autonomy for the ethnic minorities in the empire. Further south in Kiev, March would see the Centralna Rada, or Central Council, which we will combine into Central Rada for simplicity, declare themselves as the provisional government of an autonomous Ukraine. However, they also declared themselves in favor of the new provisional Russian government, and the question of independence began to circulate. The Petrograd government would make the decision to continue Russian efforts in the Great War, leading to the launch of the Kerensky Offensive in the spring of 1917. Initially, there were high hopes that this attack would mirror the Brusilov Offensive of a year earlier, and drive the Central Powers from much of their captured territory. However, disaster soon struck, as the offensive ran out of steam and the ensuing counterattack pushed them beyond their initial starting line instead. The army's morale shattered, desertion became a widespread epidemic, entire divisions would disintegrate as soldiers returned home. The people of the Russian Empire were up in arms, calling for peace, and an addressal of the domestic issues that loomed over the nation. Many of the Ukrainian soldiers and officers in the army held no hope for the new government and increasingly saw the Central Rada as a much better alternative. The idea of independence burned through the minds of many, and soon they would get their chance to break away. In October of 1917, the Bolshevik Party led a coup against the provisional government in Petrograd, and followed up by encouraging cities all over the empire to set up Soviets of their own. Kiev saw 3 days of street fighting between Republican Russian forces, soon to be rebranded into the White Armies, and the Bolshevik-led Kiev Soviet. In the end, the Whites were forced to retreat from the city. However, when the Central Rada officially came out publicly against the Bolshevik government, the Kiev Soviet was powerless to stop the arrest of the main political party members and the disbanding of its paramilitary forces. Following this defeat, the the Ukrainian Bolsheviks established the government of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in the city of Kharkov. For the Central Rada, independence was officially declared on January 22nd of 1918, and they officially became the Ukrainian People's Republic. This was almost immediately followed up with an escalation of conflicts with the Bolshevik-backed forces across Ukraine. Despite the influx of Great War veterans, the Ukrainian People's Army was vastly under-equipped and poorly organized when compared to their Soviet counterparts. The Kharkov government had launched an offensive earlier in late December, and by the end of January they had secured Poltava and Yekaterinoslav. Local Bolsheviks also formed in cities across eastern Ukraine, and joined up with the Kharkov government forces. On February 9th, the Soviet forces entered Kiev and the Rada relocated to the city of Zhytomyr. By this time, practically everyone in Ukraine split to join one side of the conflict. Russian military units declared for either the People's Republic or the Ukraine Soviet. The Russian front line with the Central Powers had disintegrated, and Germany, which was facing potential starvation at the time, recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic as the legitimate government in exchange for food supplies. They launched a counterattack against the Soviet forces and took back Kiev on March 1st. The following Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3rd, placed the Ukraine under the Central Powers' influence. The combined forces of Germany, Ukraine, and Austria-Hungary then continued to drive Bolshevik forces out. The superior organization, tactics, and equipment of the Central Powers cleared through Ukraine in no time, as their forces entered Kharkov on April 8th. By the end of April, all Bolshevik forces had been driven from Ukraine. However, with a new alliance, also came a new leader. On April 29th, the Ukrainian general Pavlo Skoropadsky launched a coup with the German backing against the Rada. He then proclaimed the Ukrainian state, placing himself in charge. Despite the political turmoil, and with the Central Powers backing, Ukraine saw a time of peace throughout the summer. All Ukraine could do was prepare for the future once the Central Powers won the war. The problem was that the Central Powers didn't win the war. In November, with German forces retreating from all their Eastern Front gains, the socialists in Kiev staged an uprising and surrounded the city. On December 14th, Skoropadsky abdicated and fled to Germany. The Socialist Directorate of the Ukrainian People's Republic took charge and was immediately faced with all the problems Skoropadsky had left behind. The Ukrainian People's Army had maintained its borders mainly with German and Austro-Hungarian backing, and without it, the Soviets had resumed hostilities and invaded once again. This was coupled with an Allied intervention in the south, with forces landing in Sevastopol and Odessa. Then there was the issue of the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire, which only brought more problems for the new government. Eastern Galicia, a territory formerly under the Austrian half of the empire, consisted of two main ethnic groups. The rural areas and countryside was populated with ethnic Ukrainians, while the city of Lviv, or Lvov in Polish, was a majority Polish city. During the collapse of the empire, the Ukrainians had been quick to form a new government inside the city known as the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. And you know what? I'm not saying that every time, so we're going to go with WUPR. Polish paramilitaries engaged the WUPR almost immediately and signaled for the Polish Second Republic to intervene, which they did, leading to the Polish-Ukrainian War of 1919. This war was a disaster for the Ukrainians. Despite the signing of an act of union between the Western and Ukrainian People's Republics in January, there was nothing they could do to save their situation. The Ukrainian People's Army was collapsing as Soviet forces steamrolled their overextended front line. The situation appeared to stabilize by the end of April, with the WUPR paramilitaries and the People's Army securing the east. But then, disaster struck. In the very last days of April, a Soviet offensive pushed the People's Army from north of the Zbruch River, and a Polish-Romanian offensive forced the WUPR into a cramped corridor between the Zbruch and Dnieper rivers. After one last failed counterattack, the WUPR forces combined with the rest of the People's Army and joined in an offensive in mid-July to push back Soviet forces. By doing so, they abandoned East Galicia completely, never to fight there again. By this point, morale was at an all-time low, desertions were common, and typhus ran rampant. Though still alive, the cause had almost completely ceased to exist. Meanwhile, throughout Ukraine, 1919 would see the White Army launch a major combined offensive in the south and east of Russia, putting the Soviets on the back foot, and even seeming like they might be able to win the war. However, come January, the White Armies in Ukraine had been decisively defeated, and all southern gains besides Crimea had been lost. Even so, the snuffed flame of Ukrainian independence was to be reignited once more, this time by an old enemy now turned ally. Simon Petlura, the president of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which by this point inhabited a small territory in western Ukraine, signed the Treaty of Warsaw with Józef Pilsudski, the Polish chief of state, for mutual support. The Ukrainians would recognize Polish hegemony over eastern Galicia, and Poland would in turn support Petlura's government. With the outbreak of Polish-Soviet hostilities in 1919, Pilsudski would publicly support an independent Ukraine to weaken Russia. However, privately, his motives are still debated on to this day. Some argue that he never actually intended to secure an independent Ukraine, and just wanted their help winning the war. Regardless of which is true, the combined offensive began in late April 1920. It was characterized by light fighting and a lot of movement. The Soviets were unprepared as they were still regrouping from the last combat operations. In their full retreat, they practically abandoned Kiev, leaving it open for Polish-Ukrainian forces to enter on May 7th. However, the entire front had become overstretched, and the Bolshevik forces were only growing stronger. Beginning in late May, Soviet General Mikhail Tukhachevsky launched a counterattack and drove the Polish out of Ukraine. Initially, it saw little gains, but on June 5th, cavalry broke through the weak spots in the Ukrainian defensive line and drove all the way to Zhytomyr, threatening to encircle the Polish-Ukrainian forces. On June 10th, the alliance abandoned Kiev and were able to retreat without a decisive defeat. However, by July, Ukraine was once again abandoned except for Lviv. Ukrainian forces would continue to fight throughout the war, but in the end, the cause was lost. Pressured by the West, Poland would sign a truce with the Bolsheviks after achieving victory at the Second Battle of Warsaw. Peace negotiations were finalized by November 2nd. The Ukrainian People's Army, now around 23,000 men, attempted an offensive into Ukraine, but they were decisively defeated on the 10th in various engagements, ending their official operations. Later in the month, Soviet forces overran the White Russians in Crimea. The Treaty of Riga, signed March 18, 1921, was the death blow for the Ukrainian dream of independence. The Poles secured Soviet recognition of their claims to Galicia and West Volhynia. The Soviets secured Polish recognition to their claims of the rest of Ukraine. The last action of the war happened on October of 1921, when what was left of the People's Army launched a guerrilla campaign into Ukraine, seeing minor success. However, on November 17th, the force was surrounded and destroyed, finally ending the war for good. The Ukrainian War of Independence was a chaotic time for the entire country. Kiev was constantly taken and retaken many times, and in the end, the weary population couldn't defeat the Bolshevik forces. The war took a major toll on both the soldiers and the civilians, and the total casualties is extremely hard to calculate. However, what is certain is that this war would not be forgotten, and on August 24th, 1991, nearly 70 years after the end of the war, Ukraine would declare its independence once again.